Late autumn, 1991. The Sulphur Springs Valley in southeastern Arizona, where the Chiricahua Mountains stand brown and quiet, on the eastern edge of the sky, and the wind comes down off them carrying dust, fine as flour. Let me tell you about a morning in the town of Wilcox, when a tractor that nobody could start became the reason an old man got laughed at in front of half the county. Because that tractor, you see, was already famous, and not in a good way. It was a 1948 John Deere Model A, a green two-cylinder machine, the kind old-timers called a Johnny Popper for the slow, lazy way it talked when it ran. Pop, 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 like a heartbeat you could count. This one had been sitting on the Carver place for years, and when the Carver family lost the farm to the bank that fall, everything went up for sale on the dirt lot behind the equipment dealer on Haskell Avenue. Cattle panels, hay rakes, a chest freezer, and that old green tractor. Now here's what you need to understand. The tractor looked the part. Somebody years back had gone over it with care. The green paint was faded, but honest. The flywheel turned. The tires held air. By every appearance, it was a machine that ought to run. And yet, for 3 weeks, nobody could make it. The dealer's own mechanics had tried. 2 of them. Young men who knew modern diesels inside and out. Men who could rebuild a turbocharger before lunch. They cranked that flywheel by hand the way you start a Model A, spinning it hard and fast, and the engine would cough, sputter, throw a little blue smoke, and die. Again and again. They checked the spark. They pulled the plugs. They cleaned the points in the magneto. They drained the fuel and put in fresh. Nothing. The old Deere would catch for half a second, tease them, then go silent. Word spread the way it always does in a small farming town. The dead tractor, the green one that won't run. Farmers stopped by just to watch somebody fail at it. It became a kind of entertainment during a slow harvest, and slowly the price on the little paper tag taped to the seat kept dropping. $300, $250, $200. A running Model A in those days was worth far more, even tired and old. But a dead one? A dead one was scrap, iron to be hauled off and sold by the pound. And this is the part that matters. Down in that valley, an old tractor wasn't a hobby. It was a tool a working man might still use. The pecan orchards needed mowing between the rows. The small alfalfa plots needed a slow, steady machine to pull a wagon. A Johnny Popper sipped fuel and never quit, if it ran. So a few men eyed that green tractor with real interest, then walked away shaking their heads. Nobody wanted to buy somebody else's headache. Nobody, that is, except Earl Dawson. Earl was 73 years old that autumn. A lean man, tall once but stooped now, with hands that looked like they'd been carved from mesquite root. Knuckles swollen, skin brown and cracked. The nails always dark no matter how hard he scrubbed. He'd spent his whole life fixing other men's machines. Earl had never owned a farm of his own. He'd been a tenant, a hired hand, a man who worked the land but never held the deed to it. And because he could never afford new, he'd learned across 60 years to keep the old alive. He wore the same canvas coat he'd worn for 20 winters, patched at one elbow, and in the breast pocket he carried a small notebook with a cracked black cover. That notebook had belonged to his father, Tom Dawson, who fixed engines through the Dust Bowl years when a broken machine could mean a family went hungry. Earl had added his own notes over the decades, in pencil, in tiny, careful letters. But the oldest pages, the ones gone soft as cloth, were his father's. Earl came to the sale lot on a Friday morning. He hadn't come to buy the tractor. He'd come for a box of bolts and an old hay fork. But there was a crowd gathered around the green Deere because one of the young mechanics, a fellow named Cody, was giving it one more public try before the dealer hauled it off. Earl stood at the back of the crowd and watched. Cody spun the flywheel hard. The engine popped twice, blew a puff of smoke, and quit. The crowd chuckled. Cody wiped his hands on a rag and announced loud enough for everyone that the thing was junk, that the bottom end was probably tired, that no two-banger from before he was born was worth saving. Then somebody noticed Earl. "Hey, Earl," a man called out grinning. "There's a tractor here, just your speed. Slow and old, same as you." A few men laughed. It wasn't cruel exactly. It was the kind of joke a town tells about its old men, but it stung all the same. Earl didn't answer. He shuffled forward through the crowd, slow, deliberate, his coat hanging loose on his thin frame. He walked up to that green tractor and he didn't touch it. He just looked, studied it the way a man studies the sky before deciding whether to cut hay. He walked all the way around it once, peering at the exhaust stack, the fuel tanks, the magneto bolted to the side of the engine. "Go ahead," he said quietly to Cody. "Spin it again." Cody rolled his eyes but did it. He grabbed the flywheel and threw his whole back into it. The engine spun, popped, caught for a heartbeat, and quit. And in that moment, Earl Dawson closed his eyes and tilted his head, and he listened. 10 seconds, maybe less. The whole lot watched an old man stand with his eyes shut beside a dead machine, like he was hearing music nobody else could hear. Then Earl opened his eyes. A small, faint smile crossed his face. Not because he knew how to start it, because he suddenly understood why it wouldn't. He turned to the dealer standing by the office door. "What's your bottom dollar on it?" The man blinked. "It don't run, Earl." "I heard. 150, as is. No refunds. You're buying a paperweight." Earl reached into his coat, counted out the bills slow, and handed them over. The crowd went quiet. Then somebody snorted, and the laughter started up soft and spread. The old man had just paid good money for the one machine in 3 counties that everybody knew was dead. Cody shook his head and walked off, but Earl wasn't listening to them anymore. He was looking at that green tractor, and in his mind he was already turning the pages of a notebook his father had filled with pencil 60 years before. A John Deere Model A from this era used a 2-cylinder engine that started on gasoline but ran on a cheaper fuel called distillate, close to kerosene. The operator started the engine on gas, let it warm, then switched the fuel valve over to distillate once the manifold was hot enough to burn it. This dual-fuel design saved farmers money during lean years, but it also meant the starting procedure was particular. Get the fuel or the spark timing wrong, and the engine simply would not catch. Part 2. Nobody believed Earl. That was normal, and Earl expected it. He had spent his whole life being doubted by men who measured worth in horsepower and new paint. So when he hooked a chain to the dead deer and dragged it home behind his old pickup that afternoon, half the lot watched him go and figured they'd never see the thing run. Earl's place was a rented patch on the edge of town, a sagging barn, a windmill that still pumped, and a yard full of tools that other men would have called junk, and Earl called inventory. He pulled the tractor under the barn's open shed and left it there. He didn't fire it up. He didn't reach for a wrench. He set the brake, blocked the wheels, and stood looking at it in the failing light until the sun dropped behind the Dragoon Mountains, and the air went cold. And then, for 2 days, he did something that would have confused every mechanic in Wilcox. He didn't take anything apart. He sat on an upturned bucket beside that tractor and he looked at it. He'd spin the flywheel, listen to it cough and die, and then he'd sit back down and write in the little black notebook. The young men would have called it a waste of time. But Earl belonged to a different age, an age when you couldn't just order a new part overnight, when the nearest dealer was a day's drive and money was scarce as rain. Men of his father's generation learned to understand a machine completely before they ever laid a wrench on it, because every part you pulled was a part you might break, might lose, might not be able to replace. You looked first, you listened first, you thought first. Now here's what you need to understand about how Earl worked. He wasn't guessing, he was narrowing. Every time that engine caught for half a second and died, it told him something. It told him the spark was there, because no spark means no fire at all, not even a cough. It told him fuel was reaching the cylinders, because a dry engine doesn't smoke. So the spark was present and the fuel was present, and yet the marriage of the two wasn't holding. Something in the timing of it, something in the order of things. A man could replace every part on that tractor, one by one, and spend $1,000 doing it, and never touch the real trouble, because the real trouble wasn't a part that was broken. It was a part that was in the wrong place, and you can't fix a thing in the wrong place by buying a new one. You can only fix it by understanding it. On the second morning, Earl drove back to the sale lot and found the dealer. He asked a strange question. He asked who had worked on the tractor last, before the Carvers lost the place. The dealer thought about it, said old man Carver's son-in-law had torn into it a few years back, pulled the magneto off, cleaned it up, put it back together, tried to make the spark stronger. After that, the dealer said, the tractor never ran quite right, and then it just quit running at all, and it sat in the Carver barn until the bank took everything. Earl nodded slowly. That mattered. That mattered more than anything anyone had told him yet. You see, The men at the dealership had been checking whether there was spark, and there was. Strong, fat, blue spark jumping the plug gap just like it should. They'd checked that a dozen times and crossed it off the list. Spark. Good. Move on. But Earl wasn't asking whether there was spark. Earl was asking when. And those are two completely different questions. He drove home and sat back down on his bucket. He pulled the spark plugs and laid them in a row. He turned the flywheel by hand, slow this time, real slow, watching the timing marks, listening to the soft click inside the magneto as it fired. He did it again, and again. And on the fourth slow turn, the old man went very still. That afternoon, Earl's grandson Marcus stopped by. Marcus was 19, home from a job in Tucson, and he thought the world of his grandfather even when he didn't understand him. He found Earl crouched by the tractor with the magneto cover off. "They're saying down at the lot you wasted your money, Grandpa," Marcus said, half teasing, half worried. Earl didn't look up. "They might be right. You don't believe that." "No." Earl turned the flywheel another notch and watched the magneto. "I don't." He pointed at the timing mark on the flywheel, a little notch stamped in the iron. "See that mark? That's where the spark's supposed to fire. Top of the stroke, just about. That's where she lights." He turned the wheel a hair more. The magneto clicked. "But that's not where she's firing. She's firing late, or early. I can't tell yet which. But she's firing in the wrong place." Marcus frowned. "So fix the timing." Earl smiled, the way you smile at someone who's young and means well. "It's not that simple, son. The timing on these is set by gears. Steel gears, deep inside the engine. You don't just turn a dial. If those gears are off, somebody put them together wrong." He sat back on his heels and looked at the green machine like it was a person who'd been lied about. "And I think that's exactly what happened. Somebody pulled this magneto, and when they put it back, they didn't line the marks up. They were off, maybe by one tooth. One tooth on a gear. That's all it takes." He picked up the black notebook and turned to a page near the front, a page in his father's faded hand. He read it twice. Then he closed his eyes the way he had on the sale lot, and he listened to a memory of his father's voice telling him, 60 years gone, that the loudest spark in the world does no good if it comes at the wrong moment. And for the first time, Earl let himself believe he might be right. On these old two-cylinder engines, the spark timing was controlled by the meshing of gears that drove the magneto. If a mechanic removed the magneto for cleaning and reinstalled it without carefully aligning the timing marks, the gears could mesh one tooth off from correct. The engine would still produce a strong spark, but that spark would arrive too early or too late in the cylinder's stroke. The result was an engine that cranked, that smoked, that even fired briefly, yet could never settle into a steady run. Part 3. But here's the thing about old machines. They rarely have just one problem. They have a stack of them, piled up over the years. And the trouble is that the small ones hide behind the big ones, and you can't always see the one until you've cleared the other. Earl knew this. His father had written it down in so many words on a page worn soft as a handkerchief. One fault covers another. Fix what you can see, and the next will show itself. So before Earl tore into those timing gears, a real job, a job that meant splitting the engine and risking that he'd never get it back together, he decided to be sure he wasn't chasing a ghost. He decided to start with what he could see and touch first. Because a wise man, his father used to say, clears the easy ground before he digs the hard hole. You fix the small visible thing first, not because you think it's the answer, but because once it's gone, it can't fool you anymore. It can't hide behind itself. And the first thing he could see was the fuel. That morning, Earl drained the little gasoline starting tank. The small one, separate from the big distillate tank. He drained it into a clean glass jar and held it up to the light coming through the shed door. And he frowned. Because what came out wasn't clean gasoline. It was cloudy, yellow-brown, and it smelled wrong. Sharp and stale and faintly of varnish. Old fuel. Fuel that had sat for years, gone to gum, separated, and soured. Whoever had last tried to start this tractor had been spinning that flywheel and feeding the engine ruined gas that could barely burn. No wonder it wouldn't catch down at the lot. No wonder those young men had given up. They'd been trying to light a fire with wet wood and blaming the matches. Earl set the jar down and looked at it a long while. He'd seen fuel like that more times than he could count, in machines that had sat out a hard time. A death in the family, a bad year, a farm gone quiet. Fuel told you the history of a machine if you let it. This fuel told him the tractor had been left to sleep, and nobody had thought to wake it gently. Now this was real. This was a true problem, and Earl knew it might explain a great deal. He cleaned the little tank out completely, scrubbed the gum from the carburetor's starting passages, blew the lines clear, and filled the starting tank with fresh gasoline from a clean can. His hands moved slow, but sure. Marcus watched, holding the light. "You think that's it?" the boy asked. "Maybe." Earl wiped his hands. "Let's find out." He set the fuel valve to gasoline. He set the choke. He took hold of the flywheel. And for a man of 73, Earl still had iron in his shoulders. And he spun it hard. The engine popped. Popped again. Caught. And for the first time in years, that old John Deere Model A ran. Pop, pop, pop. Slow and uneven. Blue smoke rolling from the stack. The whole machine shaking on its wheels. Marcus let out a whoop and grabbed his grandfather's arm. "You did it! Grandpa, you did it!" And for about 15 seconds, Earl let himself believe it too. Then the engine stumbled. The steady pop turned ragged. It missed, caught, missed again, like a man trying to walk on a bad ankle. The smoke thickened. The tractor bucked, coughed hard, and died. The yard went silent except for the windmill creaking overhead. Marcus's face fell. What happened? It was running. Earl stood looking at the quiet machine, and strangely, he didn't look disappointed. He looked more certain than before. He pulled out the notebook and wrote a line in pencil, because the tractor had just told him the truth. The bad fuel had been real, but it hadn't been the whole story. With clean gas, the engine could finally catch and run for a few seconds, but it couldn't hold. It couldn't settle. Something else, deeper, was still wrong. And now, with the fuel problem cleared away, that something else had nowhere left to hide. The gas was bad, Earl said quietly. That's why it wouldn't catch at all down at the lot. Couldn't even get a fire going on that rotten fuel. He nodded slowly. But that's not what's really wrong with her. Then what is? Earl looked at the green tractor a long moment. The fuel was the loud problem. It was hiding the quiet one. He set his hand on the cold exhaust stack. She ran. You heard her. But she ran wrong. Listen next time. Not to whether she runs, to how. That evening, after Marcus drove back to town, Earl stayed out in the shed alone with the tractor. The valley went gold, then gray, then dark. He didn't turn on the work light. He just sat on his bucket in the dusk and ran the sound of those 15 seconds over and over in his mind. The pop, pop, pop. Then the stumble. He'd heard that stumble before, somewhere, long ago. He knew it the way you know a face you can't quite name. There, but just out of reach, waiting for you to stop chasing it before it would come. He pulled the black notebook onto his knee, though it was too dark to read it. He didn't need to read it. He needed to remember. He thought about all the years he'd spent fixing machines that weren't his, on land that wasn't his, for men who paid him in cash and forgot his name by supper. He'd never resented it. Not really. The machines didn't care who owned them. A tired engine treated a rich man and a poor man exactly the same. And there was a kind of justice in that Earl had always found comforting. And somewhere in the quiet, in the creak of the windmill and the far-off bark of a dog, the memory of his father's hands moving over a green engine just like this one began, slowly, to come back to him. The patient way the old man would cock his head. The way he'd say hush now, let her talk whenever young Earl reached too quick for a wrench. An engine running on contaminated or stale gasoline often will not start at all, because gum and water foul the carburetor and prevent a clean burn. Clearing the fuel system is a logical first repair, but fresh fuel only restores what good fuel allows. If a deeper fault remains, in compression, in valves, or in ignition timing, the engine may start and run briefly, then fail to sustain itself. Experienced mechanics learn to treat a partial success as a clue, not a victory, because it reveals what the larger problem had been hiding. Part 4. Tuesday came in cold and clear, the way good harvest mornings do down in that valley, with frost on the alfalfa and the mountains sharp as cut glass against the sky. Marcus came out early, and he found his grandfather already in the shed, sitting by the tractor with the black notebook open on his knee and a strange, settled look on his face. The look of a man who'd finally found a word that had been on the tip of his tongue all night. "You figured it out," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. "I think I did," Earl said. "Last night. Wasn't a thing I saw. Was a thing I heard. or didn't hear. He stood up slow, his knees cracking, and laid a hand on the engine. When she ran those 15 seconds, you remember the sound? Pop, pop, pop. That's how you remember it, but that's not how she sounded. Earl's eyes were far away. A healthy Johnny Popper. She's got a rhythm, even, like a clock. 2 cylinders, taking turns, steady as a man walking. Pop, 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 pop. He tapped the metal in even time. But this one, she was off. The 2 cylinders weren't taking even turns. One was coming too soon. Pop, 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 pop. Limping, firing out of time. He nodded to himself. That's the magneto gear, off by a tooth. Just like I thought down at the lot. The bad gas was hiding it. Now it's the only thing left. Now here's the part that matters. And it's the reason Earl Dawson could do what 2 young mechanics couldn't. Those men had test equipment. They had a spark tester that lit up bright and told them the spark was strong, and they'd believe the machine. But a spark tester only tells you if. It doesn't tell you when. It can't hear rhythm. It can't tell you that a strong spark arriving a hair too early is worse than a weak spark arriving on time. Only an ear that had heard 10,000 of these engines run could catch that limp in the rhythm. Earl had that ear. His father had given it to him 60 years before in a dirt floor shed not so different from this one. So Earl went to work, and this was the real work, the work nobody else had dared. He split the engine open at the timing gear cover, careful, slow, laying every bolt out in order on a clean rag so he'd know exactly where each one went back. Marcus held the light and didn't say a word. Inside, the gears sat meshed together, dark with old oil. Earl wiped them clean and found the timing marks stamped into the steel. Small dots, one on each gear, meant to line up tooth to tooth. They didn't line up. They were off. By exactly 1 tooth. Earl let out a long breath. He'd been right. Some careless hand, years ago, cleaning that magneto, had dropped the gear back in 1 notch off and never known the difference. 1 tooth, on a wheel of 40. Enough to throw the spark out of step. Enough to kill a tractor and shame 2 mechanics and drop the price to $150 and make a whole town laugh at an old man. He pulled the gear, turned it 1 tooth, and set the marks dot to dot, true and square. Then he closed it all back up, bolt by bolt, in the order they'd come out. By noon it was done. Earl set the fuel valve to gasoline, set the choke, and stood beside the flywheel. The sun was high now, and the shed was warm. And Marcus stood back with his hands jammed in his pockets, hardly breathing. Earl spun the flywheel. The engine popped, and then it caught. And this time it didn't stumble. It rolled into a rhythm, even and round and steady. 2 cylinders taking even turns like a heart that had finally remembered how to beat. Pop, 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 pop. Strong, clean. Blue smoke cleared to nothing as the engine warmed, and after a minute, Earl reached down and switched the fuel valve over to distillate, and the old Deere never missed a beat. It ran the way it had run in 1948, the way it was built to run, the way it would run for another 50 years if a man treated it right. Marcus laughed out loud and slapped his knee. Earl just stood there, one hand resting light on the warm green fender, listening to that even, honest rhythm. And he was smiling. Not a big smile, just a small one. The kind that comes from being proven right about something you were always sure of in your bones. Word got back to town, of course. It always does. Some of the men who'd laughed came out to Earl's place over the next week, leaning on the fence, pretending they'd come about something else. Cody, the young mechanic, drove out and stood listening to the Deere idol for a long time before he said anything. Finally, he asked the question they all wanted to ask. What did you hear, Earl? That first day at the lot. We spun it 100 times. What did you hear that we didn't? Earl was quiet a moment. Then he reached into the breast pocket of his old canvas coat and pulled out the little black notebook, soft and cracked with age. And he held it up. I heard what was in her, he said. Not what she was doing. What she was trying to do. He tapped the notebook against his palm. My daddy fixed engines in the dirty 30s, when a dead tractor meant kids went hungry. He couldn't afford to be wrong, and he couldn't afford new parts. So he learned to hear what a machine was telling him. He wrote it all down in here, and he taught me. Earl looked at the green tractor idling easy in the Arizona sun. A machine don't lie, Cody. It can't. It just talks in a language folks quit learning. You all were busy reading testers and reading the price tag. Nobody was listening to the tractor. He climbed up into the seat then, slow and stiff, and set the black notebook down beside him on the worn steel. And he drove that old John Deere out of the shed and down between the bare pecan rows, the engine popping along even and sure. A 73-year-old man and a 43-year-old machine that everyone had given up for dead, moving together across the valley floor in the gold November light. Marcus watched him go from the fence. And there, on the seat beside his grandfather, rising and falling with the gentle rock of the tractor, sat the little black notebook. The words of a man dead 40 years, still keeping a green engine alive. The two-cylinder John Deere tractors built from the 1930s through the early 50s were among the most durable machines ever made, and tens of thousands still run today, often in the hands of the families who first bought them. Their simplicity is their strength. With proper timing, clean fuel, and basic care, they can outlast the people who repair them. The knowledge to keep them running was once passed from father to son in farm sheds across the country. And where that knowledge survives, so do the machines.